Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
I hope everybody can see the first slide, conformal mappings. Okay, so this is an extra lecture to discuss this important topic, conformal mappings. So the last topic of this course is conformal mappings. Let's look at conformal mappings. So roughly speaking, a conformal map between two subsets of Rn is a differentiable mapping that preserves magnitude and orientation of the angles between the directed curves. And there's a more general class of mappings which only preserves the magnitude of angles between directed curves, but not necessarily their orientation. And these are called isogonal mappings. So we will focus our attention on studying conformal mappings between open subsets of C. And conformal mappings also happen to be of great importance in physics and engineering. And it's an aspect that I'm not well familiar with. So let's start with the precise definitions. So begin with an open domain in C, so omega, and let F be a holomorphic function on omega. C is a smooth parameterized curve in omega, parameterized represented by the equation z of t, a less than or equal to t less than or equal to b. So now consider the image of C under F and call it gamma. So it's parameterized by W, which is f of zt. So zt is the parameterized curve C, f of zt is the parameterized curve gamma. And suppose C passes through z0, which is z of t0. T0 is some point between A and B, at which fz is analytic and f prime z0 is not equal to 0. Anyway, f is holomorphic everywhere on omega, but the crucial assumption now is that derivative is non-zero. Then by chain rule, what do you get? You get w prime of at t0 is equal to f prime at z of t0 times z prime at t0. Yeah, this is just the usual chain rule. You have z of t is a function of t, and then you're composing it with the function f, so take the derivative. So w prime at t naught is f prime z t naught times z prime t naught. Okay, now since f prime z t naught is non-zero, we get argument of w prime t naught is argument of f prime z t naught plus argument of z prime t naught. Here I'm using that the derivative is non-zero, only then does the argument make sense. So argument multiplies when you multiply, adds when you multiply two complex numbers. So argument of w prime t naught is argument f prime z t naught plus argument of z prime at t naught. This being the case, thus if the directed tangent to C at z naught makes an angle theta with the x-axis, then gamma makes an angle theta plus argument of f prime z naught with the x-axis. Yeah, so take any curve, take any parameterized curve. So once you have a parameterized curve, then at any point you have the directed tangent. Tangent has a direction. If you reverse the parameterization, the tangent reverses the direction. The magnitude remains the same. So you have the directed tangent at any point, and this will make an angle. So if the original curve makes an angle theta, its image makes an angle theta plus argument of f prime z naught with the x-axis. So angle is simply adds by this constant factor argument of f prime z naught. So consequently, if C1 and C2 are two smooth parameterized and hence also directed curves passing through z naught, intersecting at an angle phi at z naught, meaning the tangents make an angle phi, then their images also make an angle phi at f of z naught. Because this extra term, which is argument of f prime z naught, that is the same for both C1 and C2. So that cancels when you take the difference. And so argument of image of C1 and argument of image of C2, the angle the difference is the same as the tangent to f of C1 and f of C2 at f of z naught is the same as the angle between the tangent to C1 and C2 at z naught. Because of this angle preserving property, a holomorphic function w equal to f of z is said to be conformal at z naught if the derivative at z naught is non-zero. So any doubt so far? Yeah, so this is the basic definition of the lecture, that a function is conformal if the at a point if the derivative is non-zero, and the motivation being that once the map is conformal, it preserves angles. Okay, so this is probably okay. So let me go ahead. So examples, let's see some examples and let's see some non-examples. So for so what's an example of a function for which derivative is non-zero at all points? Well, e raised to z is this God-given function. So w equal to e raised to z is conformal at all points since the derivative is everywhere non-vanishing. So consider two lines C1, which is the line x equal to constant C1, and C2 is this line y equal to constant C2. Yeah. So C1 is parallel to the y-axis, C2 is parallel to the x-axis. The first one is directed upwards and the second one is directed to the right. We are now looking at directed curves. So orient the first curve in the upward direction, the second one in the from left to right. Yeah. And so these two curves intersect at C1, C2 at right angles. So under this transformation, these lines get mapped to positively oriented circle around origin and a ray from the origin respectively. So what happens when I take the image of C1? C1 is this line where x is constant. So it's a line parallel to the y-axis. If it's a line parallel to y-axis, we know that the image is a circle. For example, if you take the y-axis, the image is the unit circle. And as you go towards the right, the radius, as you take lines parallel to the y-axis on the right, their radii increases. As you take parallel lines to the y-axis on the left, the radii of the image decreases. Yeah. So if I take this line x equal to c1, depending on what this constant c1 is, its image is going to be a circle of certain magnitude around the origin, centered at the origin. So that is the image of C1, which is a directed circle. What happens to image of C2? C2 is where y is constant. So it is so x is varying. So yeah, it's like e raised to x plus I C2, and I'm allowing x to vary. The image of this line C2 is given by e raised to or e raised to t plus I times. So so if I take e raised to x plus I times C2, what do I get? I get e raised to x into cos C2 plus I sin C2, right? So it you can just see immediately that this has constant. So e raised to x times cos C2 plus I sin e raised to e raised to x in times bracket cos C2 plus I sin C2. So x is varying and the C2 is constant. So the all these points lie on a line passing through the origin. So image of C2 is a line passing through the origin, and so line passing first. Well, to be precise, it doesn't it never hits the origin actually, but it's if you extend it, it hits the origin. Okay, it is but the image in any case the image is a is a line. I mean, origin is never attained, but this will come close to arbitrarily close to the origin. So anyway, the point is when the image of C1 is a circle, the image of C2 is this ray emanating from the origin, and the two will again intersect at right angles. A line through the origin as well and a circle will also again intersect somewhere at right angles. That means the tangents will make right angles. So under this transformation, the line get matched to a positively oriented circle around origin and a ray from the origin respectively. Thus the images also intersect at right angles. And also note that the orientation is respected under the mapping. The angle between C1, C2 as well as their image is minus 90 degrees. If I'm going from C1 to C2, then the angle is minus 90 degrees. And similarly, you can see that the the tangents at the point of intersection also make angle minus 90 degrees. So this is a basic example of a conformal mapping. Any doubts? Yeah, can I go ahead? Is this okay?
Yes, sir.
So anyway, this is easy checking. I'll leave it to you. So let's take another example. Just consider any holomorphic function now. Fz equal to u of xy plus I of v of xy on the complex plane. And consider the level curves u of xy equal to c1 and v of xy equal to c2. Suppose these level curves intersect at z0 with f prime z naught not equal to 0. So the first level curve is where u of xy is a constant. Second is where v of xy is a constant. Then the transformation fz is conformal at z naught and maps u of xy equal to c1 and v of xy equal to c2 into the lines u equal to c1 and v equal to c2, which are orthogonal at w naught equal to f of z naught. Yeah, u equal to constant and v equal to constant will of course intersect orthogonally. So when I take the images of these two curves, u of xy and v of xy, I get two perpendicular lines, u and v, which intersect orthogonally at w naught equal to f of z naught. Thus, by the earlier discussion, u of xy and v of xy are also orthogonal at z naught. This can be checked directly. So I'll just leave this little checking to you. Check that with this kind of hypothesis, take u of xy equal to constant, v of xy equal to constant, and suppose at the point of intersection the derivative is non-zero, then the intersection is transversal. Not transversal, the intersection is orthogonal. So check just from first principles that u of xy and v of xy are orthogonal at z0. So this is a sort of very general example. What about some non-examples? Let's take the mapping z goes to z bar, which is a reflection about the real line. This is isogonal but not conformal. So it preserves angles. Reflection about the x-axis will preserve angles, but it does not preserve the orientation. So if the angle from the x-axis to the y-axis is plus pi by 2 going from x-axis to y-axis, but when I take the image, x-axis is preserved, y goes to minus y, so the angle becomes minus 90 degrees, because now you're going, when you take the image, the angle is taken in the clockwise direction, so it's minus 90 degrees. So the magnitude is preserved, but the orientation is not preserved, so this is isogonal without being conformal. The mapping z goes to z square is not conformal at 0 and does not preserve angles. So if I take the real and imaginary axis, their images will be the real axis and real axis. The real axis goes to itself. The imaginary axis also gets mapped to the real axis. And the original angle between the real and imaginary axis is 90 degrees. The angle between the images will be 120 degrees. Y-axis will go to will go to the real axis, but with opposite orientation. So the angle actually doubles. Thus the angle between the curves through 0 gets doubled. And this is true for any smooth curves passing through origin. This is a special case of the following more general fact. So if z0 is a point at which the first m-1 derivatives vanish, then the angle between the smooth curves passing through z0 gets multiplied by m on taking image. So there's nothing special about z goes to z square. Take any function for which is not conformal at a point. So certain number of derivatives will be non-zero. So that minus some m-1 derivatives will be certain m-1 derivative first m-1 derivatives will be 0, and when I take two smooth curves passing through the point and take the images, the angle between the images is m times the angle between the original curves. So these are non-examples. These are examples of mappings which are not conformal. Any doubts so far? Yeah. So I guess this is quite elementary. So yeah. So therefore, this last comment shows that angles being preserved is necessary and sufficient condition for the or rather I should say the derivative not being 0 is a necessary and sufficient condition for the angles to be preserved. If you have a holomorphic function, then the angles between two curves passing through z0, if that has to be preserved on taking image, then the derivative at z0 has to be non-zero. Yeah, so it goes both ways. Okay, now I come to a very, very important theorem. Wanted an occasion to talk about this theorem, the inverse function theorem. So the inverse function theorem is a very general theorem, and what we are going to now look at is a special case of inverse function theorem, which is for functions defined between open subsets of C. But this theorem has a vast generalization to functions between open subsets of Euclidean space of any dimension. So let us understand holomorphic mappings. So in the neighborhood of a conformal point. So recall the following basic fact from calculus. So suppose I have a C1 function on the real line. So I'm just motivating the inverse function theorem by giving a relevant example from real analysis. So suppose I take a C1 function on the real line and suppose the derivative at a point is non-zero. Then in a neighbor at some point x0 is non-zero. Then in the neighborhood of x0, the function is either strictly increasing or strictly decreasing. In particular, it is injective in a neighborhood of x0. Yeah, if the derivative is positive, the function is strictly increasing. If the derivative is negative, the function is strictly decreasing. In any case, it implies that in a neighborhood of x0, the function is injective. Different points get mapped to different points. Converse is not true. Even if the derivative vanishes at a point, the function could be injective in a neighborhood. So what is, can somebody just quickly give an example? Derivative vanishes, but the function is injective.
F of x is equal to x cube.
Right, correct. So that's the standard example, most basic example. Derivative of x cube is 0 at the origin, but x cube is actually a bijective function from the real line to real line. The inverse of this function being cube root of x. Every complex number, every real number has a unique real cube root, and that's the inverse of this function. So the function is injective even if the derivative vanishes. So now, okay, so all this is from calculus of one variable. So it's natural to ask for the analogous statement for functions of a complex variable. And the special case of the inverse function theorem provides the answer. What is the special case? So suppose you have a domain in C. Actually, although I have said domain here path connectedness is not important in this theorem. I could have taken any open subsets of C. Domain is not so important. So anyway, take a domain in C, doesn't matter. And let f of z be a holomorphic function on omega such that at some point z0, the derivative is non-zero. Then there exists a neighborhood u of z0 and a neighborhood v of f of z0 with f of u equal to v and a holomorphic function g from v to u such that g composed f and f composed g are identity on u and v respectively. Yeah. So what is the theorem saying? If the derivative is non-zero, locally the function admits an inverse. I can find the neighborhood of z0 and I can find the neighborhood of f of z0 on which with this neighborhood of z0 going to this neighborhood of f of z0 such that this restricted function has an inverse, holomorphic inverse. Yeah, so derivative non-zero always implies that the function locally has an inverse. Yeah. So in particular, note that f is injective on u. If a function admits the inverse, that function has to be injective. This is our basic set theory. So in particular, note that f is injective on u. So thus conformal mappings are locally injective always. And this is consistent with, for example, what we know about the exponential function. The exponential function is not injective because e raised to z is the same as e raised to z plus 2 pi I n. But locally it is injective. Around any point there is a little neighborhood I can take, not so little, in fact I can take a neighborhood of radius 1 for example, on which the function is always injective. Yeah, so exponential function is locally injective, and this is true about every conformal function. Every function which is conformal at a point is locally injective, in fact locally invertible. Okay, so this is one thing. So this is the inverse function theorem. This function, as I said, is very general. Instead of map between open subset of C, let me just quickly, although this is a bit of a digression, let me quickly say that how does the inverse function generalize to more to higher dimensions? Instead of open subsets of C, suppose I have open subset of Rn and a function. So suppose I have say a C1 function from an open subset of Rn to an open subset of Rn. Suppose I have such a function. So such a function is given by x1, x2 to xn, given by f1, f2 up to fn, n functions in n variables each. So suppose I have such a function, and the right replacement for the derivative now is the Jacobian matrix. So if the Jacobian matrix at a point is invertible, then locally the function is invertible. This is the inverse function theorem in higher dimensions. A theorem which belongs to multivariable calculus, of course, that if so, for example, if suppose I have R2 to R2, x comma y goes to u of xy comma v of xy. or to R2. Anyway, I suppose the statement is clear. They just replace the derivative by Jacobian of the function. So in other words, take the n cross n matrix whose ijth entry is del fi by del xj. Yeah, if I have the function is x1, x2 to xn going to f1, f2 up to fn, then take the matrix whose ijth entry is del fi by del xj. Suppose this matrix is invertible at a certain point in Rn, then locally the function is invertible. This is the generalization of inverse function theorem to higher dimensions. Okay, but that's a bit of a digression. So since it is very important, I thought I'll just mention it in passing. Okay, so now here is another important difference between real and complex analysis. So if Z0 in C is a point such that the derivative at Z0 is 0, then in no neighborhood of Z0 is Fz injective. To contrast this with the real case, x goes to x cube, as we just discussed, is injective in a neighborhood of 0 in spite of the derivative vanishing at 0, while the holomorphic function z goes to z cube is not injective in any neighborhood of 0. Yeah, instead of x goes to x cube from real line to itself, suppose you look at z goes to z cube from the complex plane to itself, it is not injective. Yeah. So any doubts in what we discussed in the last 10 minutes?
Sir, these would be actually completely different theorems, right? That I mean the first theorem is that if it is non-zero, then it is injective.
Yeah.
And the other one being that if it is not if it is 0, then it cannot be injective.
I would not say completely different. Rather, in one case, it is in the real case, it's a one-way implication. And in the case of the complex variable, it's an if and only if statement. In the real case, derivative non-zero is a sufficient condition for the function to be locally injective. In the case of a complex variable, the condition is both necessary and sufficient. This was the inverse function theorem, and this is the one of the consequences of inverse function theorem, local injectivity.
Sir, what about the real analytic case? Then would.
But x goes to x cube is real analytic.
Oh, all right.
Right. So this was inverse function theorem, very, very important theorem. It's nice that we had a occasion to talk about it. Now, a very important subclass of conformal mappings are what are called biholomorphisms. So definition, if U and V are open subsets of C, not necessarily domains, a biholomorphism from U to V is a mapping F from U to V, which is bijective and holomorphic. If such a mapping exists, U and V are said to be biholomorphic. So biholomorphism if a function exists, and in that case U and V are biholomorphic. Note in particular by the earlier remark that such an Fz is conformal at all points, because we just now saw that injective means derivative has to be non-zero at all points. So if it is biholomorphic, in particular, it has to be conformal at all points in U. And now an easy exercise shows that the inverse mapping is automatically holomorphic. So I'm only demanding that F from U to V is bijective and holomorphic. Once it is bijective, it has a set theoretic inverse. That inverse is automatically holomorphic. Just a consequence of the chain rule, some sense. So you can just try and prove this. So if you have a bijective holomorphic map, the inverse function is automatically guaranteed to be holomorphic. So thus a bioholomorphism is a bijective map which is holomorphic both ways. The function as well as its inverse both are holomorphic. So this is biholomorphism. This is just a definition at this point. So clearly composite of biholomorphisms is a biholomorphism, and the inverse of a biholomorphism is a biholomorphism. And in view of the special case of the inverse function theorem stated earlier, a holomorphic map which is conformal at a point Z0 is a biholomorphism in a neighborhood of Z0. That was the content of the inverse function theorem. Now that we have this definition of biholomorphism, the inverse function theorem exactly says that if you have a holomorphic function which is conformal at a point, then it is a biholomorphism in a neighborhood. What's called a local biholomorphism. It's only biholomorphism in a neighborhood. That's why the word local biholomorphism. So this was exactly inverse function theorem, right? If it's conformal, then locally it has a holomorphic inverse. Okay. So what is the motivation for this definition? The motivation for this definition is simple. If two open subsets are biholomorphic, then loosely speaking, studying complex analysis on one of them is equivalent to studying it on the other. For example, if f from u to v is a biholomorphism, then one of them is path connected, respectively simply connected, if and only if the other is also path connected, respectively simply connected. More generally, if one of them is simply connected minus n points, so is the other. If g from v to c is a mapping such that gz is holomorphic on v, then if g from v to c is a mapping, then gz is holomorphic on v, if and only if g composed f is a holomorphic function on u. So a function is holomorphic on v if and only if when you pull it back to u, it remains holomorphic. And similarly, if gamma is a curve in u with winding number n around the point z0, then the winding number of f of gamma around f of z0 is also n, and so on. So in every possible way that you can think of, essentially, complex analysis on u and complex analysis on v is the same. So if you want to study complex analysis on an open set, you can replace that open set by something else which is biholomorphic to it and study complex analysis on that. So this is the advantage of this notion. Otherwise, you will have far too many open subsets of C to consider and studying complex analysis on each of them and so on. Instead of that, you can just replace your open set by something biholomorphic. So some of the statements that I have made require some work. I'm not saying all of it is obvious. For example, it's not obvious that if one of them is simply connected minus n points, so is the other. This is a non-obvious statement, and this requires some serious topology, algebraic topology. So this is not an obvious statement by any means, but it's true.
In the simply connected part, do we need it to be a biholomorphism or just a homeomorphism would have worked? Just continuous thing.
Homeomorphism will also work. In that case, that particular statement, homeomorphism will also work. I have not defined homeomorphism. That is why I didn't use the word homeomorphism.
Yeah, okay.
But if you know it, then yes, in that particular statement, homeomorphism also will work.
And will the winding number thing be useful in showing the simply connected minus n points thing?
Possible. It's possible. Possible that it will be useful. Yeah. I guess you can probably convert that into a proof. Probably yes. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, for every point you can consider a loop which only goes around that point and does not go around any other point. So you will get n many of these loops, and you can somehow try and argue that the images of those loops will also have the property that they go around one point which is missing and not go around any other point. That kind of thing. So if one of them is simply connected minus n points, the other will also be. Okay, so what are some examples? Well, the trivial is of a biholomorphism is the identity function from any open set to itself. That is obviously a biholomorphism. More generally, multiplication by a non-zero scalar defines a biholomorphism from C to C. Similarly, open disks of any two radii are biholomorphic because you can suitably sort of choose a suitable scalar, and then a disk of one radius will go to disk of another radius and so on. So these are easy examples of biholomorphisms. Multiplication by constants. A non-trivial example is the mapping from the open disk to the upper half plane. So take the open disk and take the upper half plane. Upper half plane means imaginary part strictly bigger than 0. The so-called strict upper half plane, which is an open set. The set of complex Z H, in other words, is the set of complex numbers for which the imaginary part of Z is greater than 0. That is my definition of H, the strict upper half plane. So the mapping from the open disk to the upper half plane D to H given by Z goes to I times 1 minus Z upon 1 plus Z is a biholomorphism, as one can check. But the checking in this case is easy. Once you're given this function, you can immediately write down the inverse function. So since you can write down the inverse function, it's a biholomorphism. So if U inside C is open, then a biholomorphism from U to U is called an automorphism. The figure below, so this figure is describes the biholomorphism from the upper half from the upper half plane to the disk. I've written the expression for the biholomorphism from the open unit disk to the upper half plane. But if you take the inverse of this from the upper half plane to the open unit disk, that is diagrammatically shown as below. So you can see so the upper on the left you have the upper half plane, on the right you have these circles, a family of circles contained inside the unit circle around origin. And the mapping is such that if you take these various horizontal lines in the upper half plane, as the horizontal lines approach the x-axis, the images are sort of these circles with bigger and bigger area as shown, and sort of theoretically the x-axis which is drawn in yellow will get mapped onto the unit circle. X-axis is not there in the domain. The unit circle is also not there in the domain. But as you approach the x-axis through a sequence of horizontal lines, the images will consist of these blue circles that are drawn, which slowly converge to the orange circle, which sort of converge to the yellow circle. Sorry. So closer the horizontal line is to the x-axis, larger is the image, and in the limit you get the unit circle. So this is the picture. And if you take a given horizontal line, as you go to infinity on the left or as you go to infinity on the right, the image converges to this point 1. Yeah, each horizontal line is mapping to a circle, and on each horizontal line, as you go to infinity or on the left or you go to infinity on the right, the image will converge to this point 1, 0 on the circle. So 1, 0 is not in the codomain, but it will sort of converge to that. And the positive y-axis gets mapped to the x-axis. Positive y-axis gets mapped to the sort of unit x-axis on the inside the unit circle. Yeah. So the y-axis is you can see the which is not see the y-axis is going to the x. The y-axis in the upper half plane is going to the x-axis inside the unit circle. That's the nature of the function. And as you go to infinity on the left or right, the image goes along the circle and finally it converges to the point 1, 0. So I've just explained conformal mappings through this one picture. But if you just do an internet search, you will see lots of diagrammatic explanations of conformal mappings through many examples. Okay, so upper half plane and the disk are same. From the point of view of complex analysis, these two are the same. A basic fact is that the only automorphisms of the complex plane are of the form AZ plus B. If you remember, this was one of the tutorial exercises. In fact, the only injective functions from C to C are of the form AZ plus B. So in particular, the only automorphisms of C are of the form AZ plus B with A not equal to 0. And I've written a line of explanation. This is because biholomorphisms can be seen to be proper maps, which means they have a pole at infinity, and hence they have to be polynomials. But the only injective polynomials are linear polynomials with non-zero linear coefficient. So AZ plus B are the only automorphisms of C, and therefore these are the only injective conformal mappings. Yeah, this was one of the tutorial exercises, if you remember. Injective entire function from C to C is a linear polynomial with non-zero linear term. And as a consequence of Schwartz lemma, one can show that the automorphisms of the unit disk are of the form z goes to lambda times z minus a upon a bar z minus 1, where mod lambda is equal to 1 and mod a is less than 1. Yeah, so for every lambda with mod lambda equal to 1 and mod a less than 1, you get a conformal mapping, which is actually an automorphism of the unit disk. And this is the easy consequence of Schwartz lemma. If we go back to Schwartz, we proved the Schwartz lemma as a easy application of the maximum modulus principle, and easy application of Schwartz lemma in turn is that the automorphisms of the unit disk are of this form. Yeah, if you just search a bit, you will find the proof, and the proof is quite easy. Yeah, so these are some examples of biholomorphisms. And since these are examples, let me just emphasize, since these are examples of biholomorphisms, these are also examples of conformal mappings. Okay, now let me state the really big theorem. So this is called the Riemann mapping theorem. Now I state the deep, fundamental, and really spectacular theorem of Riemann. Any open simply connected subset of C other than C is biholomorphic to the open unit disk. This fantastic theorem of Riemann. Any open simply connected subset of the complex plane other than the complex plane is biholomorphic to the open unit disk. Yeah, the whole complex plane is also open and simply connected, but that's an exception. Anything else which is open and simply connected is biholomorphic to the open unit disk. Note that by Liouville's theorem, the plane and the disk are not biholomorphic. Yeah, so this is an immediate consequence of Liouville's theorem, because from the plane to the disk, there is not even a non-constant function, let alone a biholomorphism. You cannot even find a non-constant function from the plane to the disk. So these two are certainly not biholomorphic, but so you will have to exclude the plane. And then Riemann's theorem says that anything other than the plane which is simply connected is biholomorphic to the U. And given the rigid nature of holomorphic functions, the theorem is hugely surprising and beautiful. So this theorem was conjectured by Riemann in 1851 in his thesis. He gave an incomplete proof based on the Dirichlet principle, which stated roughly as the minimizer of a certain energy functional is a solution of the Poisson equation. I should confess I don't understand what this really means. I've not tried to understand this. Minimizer of a certain energy functional is a solution to the Poisson equation. So Weierstrass found an error in the proof, and the first complete proof was due to Carathéodory in 1922 and simplified by Koebe 2 years later. So here is a link to an article surveying some complex analysis surrounding the Riemann mapping theorem. So I've given a link to a certain article. You can look at it, which gives a proof and discusses some mathematics surrounding the Riemann mapping theorem. This is a really beautiful theorem. And yeah, any doubts? So typically in our PhD course in complex analysis, this theorem is proved, but proof is not very difficult, but it takes some effort. For those of you who are familiar, somebody was using the word homeomorphism some time back. It's not even obvious that any open simply connected subset of C other than C is homeomorphic to the unit disk. Even that is not obvious. And Riemann's theorem is telling you much more. It's in fact biholomorphic. Yeah, any doubts? Anybody?
So just a confirmation, C was in the RMT, the C was removed because of Liouville's theorem, right? So
yeah.
What about stuff like quadrants or something like that, which is also tending to infinity, but because of this it's bounded? Won't those subsets, like for example, an arc of 0 to pi by 4 going to infinity or something like that?
Yeah, but
a sector, sorry.
Right, but no, but that's the point. Somehow it is only C that causes the trouble. After all, we just now saw that the upper half plane is biholomorphic to the disk. Yeah, the upper half plane is also an unbounded domain, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But that is biholomorphic to the open unit disk. So somehow it's only the complex plane that creates a problem. Nothing else creates a problem.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay. Now the Riemann mapping theorem is a special case of an even deeper and more powerful theorem called the uniformization theorem. So this is essentially the last thing I want to talk about, the uniformization theorem. Unfortunately, the precise statement involves notions that we don't have time to go into detail, but here is an idea. So in explaining this uniformization theorem, unfortunately, I'll have to be a little bit vague. To make it precise will take a lot of time, and I'll have to make far too many definitions and so on. So let me try and explain the theorem in a somewhat informal style. So it turns out that one can study complex analysis on a more general class of spaces than merely open subsets of C called Riemann surfaces. So roughly speaking, these are surfaces in which every point has a neighborhood which can be identified with an open subset of C. However, globally, the space is very different from an open subset of C. It could even be compact. So this is what a Riemann surface is. The sphere is such an example, and I have drawn two more examples. I have drawn three more examples. The first is called a torus. The second is what's called a two torus, and the third example is what's called the Riemann surface for square root z. So these are three examples of Riemann surfaces. The first is the torus. This as a topological space. This is just circle cross circle. You know, if you think about this, is the hollow sort of the a hollow cycle tube. So there is a circle, and at every point on the circle, you have another circle in the transverse direction. That's how the torus is constructed. S1 circle, S1 cross S1. So that is torus. What the second example is what's called a two torus. What I can do is I can take two such tori, scoop out a disk from each of them, and then join them together. So that gives me what's called a two torus. And in general, I can take n tori. Instead of two such torus sort of has one hole in the center. The two torus has two of them, and in general, I can consider the n torus in similar way for any non-negative integer n. So these are examples of Riemann surfaces. Locally, if you take this surface locally, every point has a neighborhood which looks like an open subset in the complex plane, but globally the space is very different from an open subset in the complex plane. That's a very naive explanation of what a Riemann surface is. You are basically taking a large number of open subsets of the complex plane and gluing them to get more complicated objects. And on these more complicated surfaces, one can do complex analysis in one variable. And the third example that I have drawn here is the so-called Riemann surface for square root z. If you remember from a few lectures back, square root z is not a holomorphic function. Yeah, you have to restrict yourself. Square root z is basically e raised to half log z. And since defining log z is a problem, defining square root z is also a problem. So in general, you cannot define square root z as a holomorphic function on the complex plane. If you restrict yourself to a simply connected subset of the complex plane, then you can define the logarithm, and therefore e raised to half log z gives you square root z. So you can also define square root z. But what you can also do is you can construct more complicated surfaces like the one that I have drawn, the third picture that I have drawn, on which square root z makes sense. The function square root z can be defined in a consistent way on these more complicated surfaces. So the Riemann surfaces have this feature that they make multi-valued functions into single-valued functions. Square root z. The essential problem with square root z is that every complex number has two square roots. So it's like a multi-valued function. And the Riemann surfaces you can construct Riemann surfaces on which the multi-valued functions become single-valued. That is one of the features of Riemann surfaces, one of the reasons why they are important. So these are examples of Riemann surfaces, and these are not the only ones. I've just drawn three of them. So,
sir, specifically speaking, these Riemann surfaces would be basically some sort of surface living in 3 or 4 or more than 4 dimensions.
Well, incidentally, okay. So there is a small subtlety here. Actually, each one of these Riemann surfaces, at least each one of these compact Riemann surfaces actually can sits inside R3. But the embedding inside R3 is only differentiable. It does not make sense to talk about holomorphic embeddings inside R3. If you want holomorphic embeddings, all these compact Riemann surfaces, they actually sit inside. No, okay. Let me not. So okay. Let me make a sort of more watered down statement. Each one of these, at least from the point of view of topology, okay. Each one of these compact Riemann surfaces actually sits inside R3. You don't even need to go to R4. Every one of them sits inside R3, the compact ones at least. Yeah. Topologically, every surface can be thought of as a surface sitting inside R3.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
But since one wants to do complex analysis, one is not only interested in embedding it topologically, you also want the embeddings to be holomorphic, and then that's a more complicated story. Yeah, it does not help you only embed it as a topological surface sitting inside R3, because it doesn't allow you to do complex analysis. So to do complex analysis, you want to embed it inside CN or complex projective space and so on. And what is the minimum dimension of the complex Euclidean space or complex projective space inside which you can embed it is a more subtle question. Okay, so these are Riemann surfaces. Riemann was, of course, the first person to start looking at these surfaces. Riemann was truly a mathematician who was way ahead of his times. I mean, people could, systematically start studying these subjects only 100 years after Riemann, really, or at least 78, at least 80 years after Riemann. But already Riemann in the mid 19th century had deep, powerful ideas. He was really a mathematician with enormous creativity and imagination. Certainly my hero among the mathematicians of the 19th century. Okay, so this is what a Riemann surface is, very roughly. Just think of it as more complicated two-dimensional surface on which is locally like an open subset of C, and on which one can do complex analysis. This would be the naive explanation for Riemann surfaces. So just like one can talk about holomorphic maps between open subsets of C, one can also study them between two Riemann surfaces. Similarly, the notion of biholomorphism extends to Riemann surfaces. So now I will end the course by stating the all-important uniformization theorem. So the uniformization theorem, which is the biggest theorem in the Riemann surface theory, says that any simply connected Riemann surface is biholomorphic to exactly one of the following three: the complex plane, the open unit disk, or the sphere. And all these three are different from each other. Now, no two of them are biholomorphic to each other. The complex plane and open unit disk are not biholomorphic by the Liouville's theorem, and neither the complex plane nor the open unit disk can be biholomorphic to the sphere, because the sphere is compact while the other two are non-compact. So it's clear, either because of Liouville's theorem or because of topology, that all these three are distinct from each other. No two are biholomorphic, and in fact, if it's also not very difficult to show that the sphere is simply connected. So all these three are examples of simply connected Riemann surfaces, and every simply connected Riemann surface is biholomorphic to exactly one of these three. So this was the uniformization theorem. One can deduce the Riemann mapping theorem from the uniformization theorem. That is why I call it a deeper theorem. The proof of the implication uniformization theorem implies Riemann mapping theorem is relatively easy. So this is a much deeper theorem. And the first rigorous proof of the uniformization theorem was given by Poincaré and Koebe in 1907. The theorem has many applications. For example, one of the proofs of the Little-Picard theorem follows from the uniformization theorem. Little-Picard theorem, if you remember, said that if you have an entire non-constant entire function, its image can at most miss 1 point. So it's either surjective or it misses 1 point. That one of the proofs of this Little-Picard theorem is through the Riemann mapping theorem. So this is what Riemann surfaces is about, and there are higher dimensional. So these are So roughly speaking, Riemann surfaces are the generalizations of open subsets of C on which you can do one variable complex analysis. There are higher dimensional analogs of Riemann surfaces called complex manifolds on which you can do complex analysis of many variables. So those are called complex manifolds. And the study of such complex manifolds is called complex geometry. So 1 year back, I had given a PhD course on complex geometry in my department. So it's a beautiful subject, complex geometry, and one-dimensional complex manifolds are what I have drawn here, Riemann surfaces. And this theorem, this uniformization theorem, is in some sense the deepest theorem in the subject. Uses some analysis, serious. Okay, so that is all that I want to say.